Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Judge Hernandez, for that introduction. I'm going to go right into a little bit about, just in general, what is human trafficking? And it is, as Judge Hernandez mentioned briefly, we are a diverse group. So, of course, it is defined locally, state level, and we come from all over the country. But it is defined at all of those levels, and it involves compelled service across a variety of labor sectors. And it's important to remember when we're talking about human trafficking that we are talking about both sex and labor trafficking. And there is often a lot more focus on sex trafficking, and labor trafficking sometimes does get overlooked. It is sometimes even more invisible. And so it's important to remember when we're talking about definitions that human trafficking does include both, and that indeed the two do sometimes coexist. So under federal law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was the first comprehensive piece of federal legislation to really address human trafficking. And it's almost 20 years old now, which is hard to believe. But it really sort of got the ball rolling. Contains human trafficking legal definitions, criminal provisions for prosecution of traffickers, immigration protections, civil remedies, and victim benefits. And we'll be talking a lot more about some of that. Severe forms of human trafficking, which is sort of a misleading phrase because it implies that there is a non-severe form of human trafficking, like there's human trafficking light. There's not. That's really just human trafficking. So sex trafficking is defined as using force, fraud, or coercion to recruit, harbor, transport, provide, obtain, patronize, or solicit a person for a commercial sex act, or in which the person performing the act is under 18. That's a critical distinction that, if you'll notice, is not included in labor trafficking. The definitions are otherwise identical, but labor trafficking does not have that difference for minors. So what is force, fraud, and coercion? Now, some of this is exactly what you would think of. Physical force, isolation, confinement, locked in a closet, sexual abuse. Some of it is a lot more subtle, for lack of a better word. False promises of employment, education, a better life, false promises of romance or marriage. And under coercion also, that's more threats of harm to the victim, if you try to leave, I'm gonna kill everybody in your family, emotional abuse, withholding or supplying basic needs like housing, clothing, and food, very important. And lastly, unfortunately, this one is increasingly common, exploitation of drug addiction, homelessness, or personal insecurity. And the personal insecurity also fits under the false promises of romance or marriage. And we'll be talking a lot more later on in the presentation about this, but there is often such a misconception. If they aren't being locked in a closet, why don't they just leave? There are so many reasons. One of them is that manipulation of those personal insecurities, those promises of romance or marriage, that this is, I'm the only person who's ever going to love you, that sort of thing that we see in other types of cases as well. So this is important to remember. Anyone can be a target. But there are certain characteristics that make some people more vulnerable, more susceptible to the predation of traffickers. Women. A history of sexual abuse. There's an extremely high correlation between a history of sexual abuse and becoming a victim of human trafficking. Immigrants, for a couple of reasons. One, because they are already essentially isolated. They are already away from what they know, the language they know, their basic support systems, and they are susceptible to the kind of coercion that we were talking about a few minutes ago. If you try to leave, I'm gonna kill everybody in your family. Substance use and abuse, we talked about that. Youth, because who has more personal insecurities than an adolescent? And runaway and homeless youth. there's, again, a very high correlation between runaway youth, homeless youth, and a transient population, in part because they need often to trade sex for basic survival, a place to stay, food to eat that day, and LGBTQ. And there is sort of a double correlation there because there is a very high correlation between LGBTQ youth and homelessness. And so then again, the correlation between that figure and trafficking. So they are an extremely, extremely vulnerable group. And I just want to point out again that really the key factor that runs throughout this list is isolation. And anything that isolates an adolescent can essentially be a risk factor. And lastly, child welfare involvement. And this is perhaps the most telling one. That the correlation is extremely high, and that's for several reasons. One, as we mentioned before, a history of sexual abuse is already in and of itself a crucial risk factor. Secondly, children who are in child welfare have sort of, by definition, already experienced trauma. And we're going to be talking a lot more about this later, but having experienced that trauma, that has neurological effects that by itself also makes them more susceptible to the predation of traffickers. And thirdly, and this comes from a trafficking survivor who was also, had been in the child welfare system. And this woman was testifying before Congress and really wanted to explain, and she said, in a lot of ways, the child welfare system primes you for being trafficked, because even under the best of circumstances where nobody is actually trying to harm you, somebody is getting money for your well-being. And so it normalizes that sense that your physical self has a monetary value. And so all of those things together combine to make child welfare involvement, unfortunately, a very strong predictor for susceptibility to human trafficking. All right, and now I will turn it over to Judge Hernandez.
Part of the reason that we want to lay the 101 out so that you understand the victim survivors that we're dealing with is because you're going to see them in your courthouse through your stakeholders, the partners that you deal with every day, day in and day out. And there's still a lot of myths and misperceptions of what are these survivors about. Abigail said, why don't they just leave? You weren't pulled into that hotel room by a choker chain. Nobody chained you to the hotel room. Why didn't these girls, and when I say girls, please let me say, predominantly we're dealing with females as our victim survivors, but the boys and the men are absolute victims. In fact, they're very underreported and very under-identified. But please, so when I refer to the girls, know that I'm also inclusive of males in this picture. Because long ago, 25 years ago, and I know this is hard to be interactive in this stage, but how many of you remember the domestic violence cycle when we first started learning about it 25 years ago? And the answer was, well, if he or she was truly abused, why didn't they just leave? They had the opportunity to leave. We've learned a lot in a couple decades, haven't we? Well, this is where we're starting with right now with human trafficking, because these survivors, and I'm going to talk about my kids aren't very likable. They are the most amazing survivors I've ever met in my life, and incredible human beings. But when they come on your doorstep at the courthouse, whether they come in through the dependency system or the juvenile justice side, or they happen to be just a witness as a victim in the adult side, they're not the kind of child victim that we all envision of the molest, the lewd conduct on children, when we see those kind of trials and those proceedings roll out. That Everybody wants to embrace, right? Everybody wants to take those kids home because they've been so traumatized and sometimes physically, violently hurt. So have my kids. That's the part I'm going to leave you with today. I'm going to talk about Danielle, who's 12 years old, and by the time she hits the adult system to testify, she's about 14. Maybe not very likable. They're very abrasive. Why do you guys think that? Can somebody just throw out, why do you think that they might be offensive and abrasive to the general public or the court personnel that you're working with? Any ideas? They don't trust anybody. They've been damaged. They've been hurt. They've been traumatized, and they're in survival mode. And survival mode cannot look like we want it to look, which then means whether it's court personnel, whether it's our stakeholders as the lawyers or the social workers or probation officers, they're not as inclined until they understand the root behind all of this, why these children act the way they do. That's what I'm hoping that you'll leave with today, and that you'll talk to your folks back in your courthouses and your stakeholders to say, we need to learn more about the high risk child or young adult, or adult for that matter, but I focus on the juveniles because that is my wheelhouse. But Danielle fit every category that Abby talked to you about. When I first met her, she was 12 years old, not from my county. That's why we have to collaborate, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just your city, it's not just your county, your kid, your victim. It's cross county lines, it's cross state lines. And of course, I'm not dispelling the fact that we have international trafficking, but we're focusing here today on our domestic trafficking. It's pervasive everywhere. But please understand, again, this child had child welfare experience or had touched the system. She had been sexually abused as a child. Does it really shock anybody that she was so vulnerable to her exploiter who she loved? This is what we hear day in and day out. I loved him. His dreamy green eyes, the man who is 3 times my age at 12 years old, who has coerced and manipulated psychologically. Is there physical coercion? Absolutely. You know, we didn't get a lot into Romeo versus guerrilla pimps, but of course, we have the guerrilla pimps or exploiters out there that are using physical ways to exploit our children. But there's also the much more prevalent, coercive, psychological, let me wine and dine you and Romeo you in. I love him, he's my boyfriend. He's my daddy. And those are terminologies that we hear a lot of. And how they behave and how they act and why they're so distrusting of everybody, because their exploiters told them just that. You can't trust the system. You can't trust the court. You can't trust the stakeholders, those police officers, those probation officers, those social workers. They all just want to take away your freedom, baby. I'll buy you McDonald's. You go out and turn 10 tricks a night. I'll make sure I get you some fries and a Big Mac. I hear this over and over. I'm not making this up. He wouldn't lock me up. He wouldn't try to put me in a group home. He wouldn't expose me to those other kids. He let me stay in a hotel. He let me take a shower as long as I did my quota. As long as I did 10 or 12 tricks a night, I was good. I could have my McDonald's at the end. That's where they're coming from, ladies and gentlemen. That's where we need to remember why they're so different. So, who should be involved in those cases? Should we all be involved? These are our most vulnerable children, our most vulnerable population are these victim survivors. We have an obligation and a responsibility to them. And we can't just keep saying, well, that's social child welfare's job, or that's probation's job, or that's the task force from the police department to do that. No, you know what? We all need to do it together. This is one of my favorite slides. And this is a public case, and it's People versus Calhoun, and Mr. Dreamy Calhoun is now serving 23 to life. And that is because this is not all inclusive, ladies and gentlemen. This is just some of the people that were involved in this case. One single case with one young victim, minor victim, and this gives you an idea. So if you think, well, I work in court management, what do I really have to do with this human trafficking issue? A lot. Because as you'll notice, there are district attorneys, there are investigators, there are court advocates, there are providers, there are court personnel, there are deputies that are involved in the courthouse, there are multiple judges, there are FBI, the list goes on. One case, one young lady whose life was touched and changed because of all of these people. And we talk about how important and significant the fact that we collaborate is. This is when we're effective, when we are protecting our most vulnerable population. And in order to do that, you have to communicate. And I've been truly blessed by the people I work with, like these ladies to my right, but I also have tremendous support from other judicial officers. My previous judicial officer, who was my mentor, my previous juvenile presiding judge, laid the groundwork for us, for me, to carry through. I'm hoping I can do the same thing, that as I move on now to the adult side, that I can start doing education and training on the adult side, because I'll be very honest, and maybe people don't want to hear this, juvenile understands this better than anybody, because we understand child welfare, child protective services, juvenile justice involvement, and the kids that start out, those most vulnerable at-risk children that Abby described. 85% of our kids, and I think that's a conservative number, have touched the child welfare system that are victims of human trafficking. And we focus a lot on sex trafficking, and I know that's the wheelhouse again that I work in. Labor trafficking is also there, and we should not ignore that. So again, as a system, as a court family, we need to take care of these folks. I also have the ability, I call up to Sacramento, I call down to San Diego. I'm 58 counties here in California, so that's why I bring it back to, I know you're all coming from courts, whether it be big courts, small courts, in between sizes, that we need to be able to push it out to everybody. So maybe even the smaller courts that don't have the resources or the fiscal ability that some of the other courts do, this information has to be shared. The fact that I could get on the phone with an FBI agent and help get my child transported back to me safely, the fact that I could call over to my adult court system and say, you've got a victim coming in to testify, she is in custody on unrelated charges, let's not shackle her and transport her with adults, which I can tell you was happening. And you all should go back to your courthouses and find that out, because guess what? That's shameful. That should not happen with your victims, even if they're material witnesses. And of course, court management, you know what that means. And working with, whether it's your sheriff's department or whoever's transporting, you all need to work together with us, because do we really want to re-traumatize these victims any more than they've already been traumatized? But it takes collaboration, and you have to talk. So here's the cross-system stakeholders that we utilize here in Orange County. And again, I know we don't have a lot of time for questions right now, but both Abigail, Jessica, and myself have all agreed, if you have any questions after this hour period's over, we are here and we are happy to talk to you and answer any questions. We implemented, and I started what we call the Grace Court in my courthouse, which is generating resources to abolish child exploitation. At the table with me every week, we're stakeholders from all of these facets, which means doesn't get done on behalf of the child, whether the child entered to me on the child welfare side or the juvenile justice side, unless I have all of these people working together. And that means court personnel, but that means my education, county agencies, your typical healthcare agency, obviously, your child welfare agency, your probation department, law enforcement, everybody is at the table talking about that particular child. What can we do to make sure we improve outcomes? Because the reality is, folks, if we hit it on the front end, and that's what we're about, right? Is making access to justice better for all, that we help those on the front end, at the juvenile end, the family law side, getting to the root of the issue, then maybe we don't have as many filings on the criminal side. And maybe we don't have those horrible outcomes that we all know happen in our criminal justice side. Let's see if we can do some preventative pieces. And so this is what we do, is we work together collaboratively every week. Whether you designate it as a specific assigned collaborative court or you just do it in your regular day-to-day court operations, it takes court personnel with the judicial officers, with your leadership, with judicial leadership to make it happen. Because if you don't, nobody's going to make it happen. And I love one of my movies, which is, Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. Absolutely. But you've got to make them come. And you have the ability as leaders to do that. I'm going to skip over because the TVPA, Abigail talked to that. It has been reauthorized multiple times. Here in California, we issued the CASE Act, which addresses human trafficking. It passed with the highest initiative passer rate ever since the inception of the initiative process in California, which tells you, ladies and gentlemen, this is an important topic. We have lots of important topics, but this is a hot issue. It's a hot issue federally. It's a hot issue at the state level, all the way down to your local courts. So take advantage of the momentum. You have the momentum at the federal level to help you, to assist you. When we talk about resource and fiscal limitations, then go out and search. Have your team searching for those federal grants, those state grants that will help you propel your programming or your services to this particular population, but to all of our population. Again, just some more legislation that we enacted locally here in California, dealing with how I now can take jurisdiction over a child in the child welfare system if he or she is at risk or being trafficked. Which means now I can bring them into my child welfare dependency system and actually supervise them. Not because they've been affirmatively beaten or neglect or abused, but because they are at risk or are actually being trafficked under our trafficking laws here in California. We've created state protocols through our state child welfare system, which are key. But again, guess what? Got to be communicating with your state people, your legislative folks, and getting them to listen about the importance of what you are doing and working collaboratively together. Because we all know individually we're good, ladies and gentlemen, but when we're working collectively, we're really a force to be reckoned with, right? This kind of just duplicates what I've already talked about, the importance of your leadership in your courts, the importance of communicating your leadership with the other folks that you work with. Education and training starts there. You all are here, so you know this topic. You may not know it to the level and the depths that we do, but it shows that you are concerned. You know it's an issue for your court, for your county, your jurisdiction, whatever it might be called. It's important enough for you to go back and figure out, how do we educate more people? Because it's really sad the amount of people that I run into, and I do a lot of training up and down the state here in California, that don't understand this topic. They don't understand how pervasive it is. They don't understand how we need to deal with these victims. Of course, it's a culture shift. Remember, and I hate to say this, but it wasn't just maybe 5-6 years ago that most law enforcement officers in my own state referred to my 13-year-olds as the little whores, the little prostitutes, the little hookers, right? Fortunately, we have moved away from that with the new laws that are on the books, right? Decriminalizing child prostitution, but that's a major culture shift. Culture shift for your law enforcement stakeholders, but culture shift for the people that I bet if you look to your left or look to your right in your cubicles or your offices, whatever you have, still believe that. I can tell you, unfortunately, very, very smart, professional people still believe the fact that if the 13-year-old walked into the room and the exploiter wasn't there with a gun, she did it willingly, she consented to the sex, so why do we protect her? Well, because guess what? Children can't consent to sex, so how can they sell it? So we'll start off with that major premise, but that gets me on my soapbox and you don't want me to go there. But we want to take care of our kids. We want to take care of our victims. So you also want to be sure to say, okay, look it, we know that this is an issue, but let's be solution-based. Do not just throw out, this is a horrible, tragic thing, and then go, yeah, I don't know what to do about it. So much to be done about it, what you can do. How much time? Okay, let me finish up with then just talking in general about what you can do. We launched here in Orange County, Be the One campaign to help out. Orange County Transit System has these buses wrapped for us across the county. We have all of the information that is not only on buses, but in all of our transit places, hospitals, anywhere we can put it out with phone numbers, with all of the ways that you can support this issue and help out. I'm going to skip over any of the brain trauma stuff because I think Jessica or Abigail will go into that, why kids are different and what happens as a result of the trauma. But that really comes back to why our kids present the way they do, why they present so offensive sometimes and so unlikable. Finally, again, I'll finish up with there's no such thing as a child prostitute. And once we figure out that and we get that message down, then we can really go into, let's train, let's make sure that we identify early, let's make sure that we prevent. But until we get there, it's not going to happen. So I'm going to leave it and then turn it over to Jessica.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? We got you after lunch. So is everybody in like a food coma now, or are we doing all right? All right, good. Okay, so that was awful. Thank you, Judge Hernandez. I am going to actually take the focus off of minor victims and put it onto adult victims, because as Judge Hernandez and Abby talked about, human trafficking victims are not only in the juvenile legal system, we also see them in the criminal legal system as well. So we used to, I think I skipped a slide somewhere. Let me just see, sorry, okay. So there's a couple of things that I want to make sure are clear, okay? Victims of trafficking, not their traffickers, victims of trafficking have criminal records far in excess of both their prostitution customers and their traffickers, okay? And what we most commonly see, I run the only program in the state of Maryland that works with criminalized survivors. So what we commonly see is arrests and convictions for prostitution, arrests and convictions for other forced criminal activity. Traffickers force survivors to do a whole host of things besides just engage in a commercial sex act. We see convictions for trespassing. We see convictions for drug use, drug distribution, fourth-degree burglary, you name it. We see felonies, we see misdemeanors, we see it all. And these are things that people were forced to, crimes that people were forced to commit by their traffickers. We also see a lot of crimes that are kind of intersect with street survival. A lot of our clients, at least in Baltimore City, were street-based homeless at the time that they were exploited by their trafficker. And so since in most states, everything that you need to do if you don't have a home is a crime, we see a lot of convictions for crimes common to street survival. And then for our foreign national clients, obviously there's the added wrinkle of immigration proceedings that are related to having a criminal record. So when we first, year 2000, the TVPA is passed. There's a large awareness building movement in the United States that human trafficking is happening. But the focus was on the trafficker and not the trafficking survivor. So when court systems first started seeing victims of trafficking, they were being recognized as victim witnesses, right? So they were the people testifying against their trafficker, either because they were cooperating witnesses or non-cooperating witnesses. But I want to focus a little bit differently. I want to talk about the defendants who are victims of trafficking that are charged criminally. So that perspective is a huge shift in what we understand about the intersection of victims of trafficking with the legal system. So what we see in Maryland, and I'm sure what you see here, is really consistent across the country. There was a survey that was done in 2006, the National Survivor Network, really creative name. It's a network that operates on a national level made up of survivors of trafficking, right? So you know exactly what that is. So the National Survivor Network did a survey of almost 140 survivors on both sex trafficking survivors and labor trafficking survivors. And the numbers that they found, or the information that they provided, was astounding. Maybe not to the people who work exclusively with criminalized victims, but I think that they will shock you. So first of all, 91% of these survivors reported having been arrested during the time that they were trafficked. So remember, like I said, court systems are used to operating with victims in this capacity, but primarily they're being seen by you in this capacity, right? So 91% of respondents reported having been arrested. 42% of respondents reported being arrested as minors. Abby talked about the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act and highlighted that if you are a minor, so someone who is 17 years old or younger, and you're engaging in a commercial sex act, that young person is a victim of trafficking per se. So it doesn't matter if they have a trafficker. As long as they are engaging in a commercial sex act, they are federally considered victims of trafficking. But on the state level, they're being arrested for prostitution. So they're being arrested for things that we say that they are actually not even able to be. So 42% of respondents reported being arrested as minors. Over 50% of respondents reported that every single arrest on their criminal record was focused on their or stemmed from their trafficking experience. Over 40% reported being arrested over 9 times or more. So we're not talking about 1 or 2 convictions. We're talking about huge rap sheets that stem from someone being forced to commit a crime by their trafficker. 60% of respondents reported being arrested for crimes other than prostitution, like I said. You can't just focus the discussion on the fact that people are engaging in commercial sex acts. They're being forced to commit a whole host of other crimes. And then one of the more heartbreaking pieces, at least for me, was that 80% of these respondents reported that they did not report their abuse at the time of their arrest or conviction. So they're getting to all of you and they're not disclosing. And that has to do with the reality that their lives have been threatened, so they're afraid to report. They've been told by their traffickers not to report, or simply because no one ever asked them the circumstances around their arrest. 80% of these respondents did not report their victimization at the time that they intersected with all of you. So, like I said, I run the only program in Maryland that's focused exclusively on criminalized survivors of trafficking. And so why is post-conviction relief so important for survivors of trafficking? Well, the primary reason is because criminal convictions can prevent survivors from getting a job, from receiving public benefits, from furthering their education, receiving housing assistance, getting loans, obtaining immigration relief, voting, and most importantly to me, as a former social worker, in addition to having my law degree, healing from trauma. Our clients report that every single time that they go to get a job and can't get a job because they have a criminal record, they re-experience everything that happened to them. They are re-victimized, even though perhaps they have left the trafficking, their trafficker or their exploitive relationship. And the reality is, if you can't get all of these things, you're gonna go right back to what you know, because everybody's gotta survive, right? All right, continued. Why is post-conviction relief so important for survivors? It remedies a past injustice, right? They were considered a criminal defendant, they were considered a criminal, and now with focusing on alleviating the harm that the criminal justice system has done, it remedies the injustice that they experienced. It's also incredibly empowering. You're gonna hear a story at the end of our presentation today that talks about the impact that wiping away their criminal convictions had on a survivor that we worked with. It's also survivor controlled. We don't have enough time to do all the trauma material we wanted to do, but the hallmark of a trafficking experience is the lack of control the survivor has over their experiences. And so being able to control the process on the back end is really something that's incredibly healing for survivors. It's also an opportunity for them to reclaim their space, kind of linking it back with the remedying the past injustice. They were painted one way in the courtroom, and then when they go back in to clear their records, they are reclaiming their space and retelling their story. This, I have to say, has been the most impactful part of our work, and that is the impact of post-conviction relief on you all, right? The focus on really allowing the survivor to move on with their lives. It is transformative to judges, to prosecutors, to court personnel, and I hope that it is for you today. All right, another reason that post-conviction relief is so important for survivors is because it's against the law. The federal law specifically says that victims of trafficking should not be inappropriately incarcerated, fined, or otherwise penalized solely for unlawful acts committed as a direct result of their trafficker. So that's another reason that this is important, because arresting victims is contrary to federal law. I got this quote from the 2012 Trafficking in Persons report. The TIP report, as we call it, is something that's released by the Department of State every year, and basically grades countries on their anti-trafficking efforts. It's worth noting that they started releasing these TIP reports in the year 2000. The US didn't bother to check its own efforts until 2010. So the United States was grading countries on how well they were doing anti-trafficking work, but weren't grading themselves. That's just a nice little tidbit that I like to share. So this is from a US survivor of sex trafficking. She said, "I always felt like a criminal. I never felt like a victim at all. Victims don't do time in jail, they work on the healing process. I was a criminal because I spent time in jail." And that quote sums up why I run my program. So the bottom line is having a criminal record keeps survivors trapped in the very industries they seek to escape, prevents them from healing, and makes them vulnerable to re-victimization. So what the heck do we do about all of this? What we do is we enact things called vacatur laws, okay? And this part of the presentation is kind of geared towards you not as court personnel, but as citizen activists. I want you to go back to your states, wherever you live. I want you to check whether your state has a vacatur law on the books. If it doesn't, I want you to focus on getting one passed. And if your state has a vacatur law, like Maryland does, I want you to focus on improving it. New York State, my home state, became the first state in the country in 2010 to pass a vacatur law. And essentially what that means is it is a law that allows a survivor who has criminal convictions on their record stemming from their history of trafficking, they are allowed to petition the court to vacate or set aside that conviction, essentially putting the survivor back in the place that they were before they were convicted, clearing their records. Okay, so this is what the map looked like in 2010. That's what the map looks like now. Right. So does anyone see, is anyone from a state that is gray? No?
Not that they're going to admit it.
Well, they didn't do anything wrong. Oh, we got one? Where are you from?
Minnesota.
Minnesota. Get it together, Minnesota. Yep, I see you right up there. So at this point, nearly 40 states have some sort of law on the books to make it easier for survivors to vacate their criminal convictions that they got when they were trafficked. However, Maryland, where I work, it was the second state in the country to pass a vacatur law, which is a good thing, but it's the weakest in the country. I'm like looking at my two Maryland people. So even if your state has a vacatur law, you need to take a look at it, see how comprehensive it is, and then work to improve it, okay? Because these laws are essential to helping survivors reclaim their lives. So vacatur, like I said, the definition to undo or set aside a court's judgment. You'll probably hear expungement, shielding, or sealing as far as ways to address people's criminal record. Vacatur is different. Vacating a conviction means there was an error in the original judgment or conviction. And basically the way that I explain that is, had you, Your Honor, at the time you convicted me for prostitution, had you known at that time that I was actually a victim of human trafficking, you never would have convicted me in the first place because you wouldn't have found me criminally responsible for my actions. So it is a recognition that the law made a mistake, which is incredibly powerful for survivors. General elements for every vacatur law that you're going to see. There has to be the presence of trafficking, obviously. So if somebody is engaging in the commercial sex trade out of circumstance or choice, that person's not going to be eligible to vacate their conviction. They had to have been doing so under threat of force, fraud, or coercion. You have to have an eligible offense. So like in Maryland, I like to use that as an example because it's a very bad law. The only thing that's eligible for vacatur are prostitution convictions. So we have our clients that have, 3-page criminal records, and we're able to vacate like 2 convictions. So it really is an incomplete remedy, at least as the way that Maryland's law is set up. There has to be a nexus to the arrest or conviction. So if I was trafficked in 1980, I exited my trafficking situation that year, and then I get a conviction for prostitution tomorrow, that person's not going to be eligible for vacatur because it's too attenuated. It's too far away from the time that the individual was trafficked. There is some wiggle room. The case that we're going to present at the end, the client was not, she was trying to escape her trafficker and was engaging in survival sex because she was living on the margins trying to escape detection by her trafficker. So there's a little bit of wiggle room. And then due diligence. You have to bring these motions, in a timely fashion, basically. So these are the 4 elements that you're always going to see in a vacatur law. As far as an effective vacatur law, which Maryland's is not, like I said, we want to include prostitution and other offenses, because like I said, my client with 15 convictions, only 2 of which are eligible for vacatur, even though all 15 are linked with her trafficking. That's not an effective form of relief. Also want to make sure that there is no requirement that documentation of the defendant's trafficking experience be required. And the reason behind that is simply that most don't have any evidence that they were trafficked. So the survivor's word is good evidence. You also want to make sure there's no rehabilitation requirement because, like I said, people tend to stay involved in the underground economy even after being trafficked because they can't get a job or housing, right? So we have to, recognize that and not require that someone show that they have been rehabilitated, whatever that means. Excuse me. Also want to make sure that there are built-in confidentiality and privacy standards into the vacatur law so the client's entire life is not public record. And finally, you want to vacate all of the records rather than just shielding them from public view. You want to make sure that that conviction comes off the record. Who's from California? You guys have the strongest vacatur law in the country. Penal Code 236.14. Any nonviolent offense is eligible. That's awesome. That's what we're trying to do in Maryland. There's a clear and convincing standard of proof that the act or the crime that the survivor is trying to vacate is a direct result of being a victim of human trafficking. There's no requirement of documentation. There's no requirement that you show that the survivor has been rehabilitated. The procedural piece, the state has 45 days to respond. Otherwise, the court can go ahead and grant the petition. In Maryland, before I can even file a petition on behalf of one of my survivors, I have to get the prosecuting body. So the state's attorney that prosecuted my client has to sign and consent to that motion. So it is a hot mess up in Maryland. And then some more procedural stuff. And then vacatur is required if the petition is granted, whereas in Maryland, the judge is allowed to vacate the conviction, order a new trial, or modify the sentence. That's not helpful. Vacate the conviction if the person was trafficked at the time that they were convicted. Okay, so I'm gonna actually bring Abby up, and we're gonna talk through a very interesting case that Judge Waxman and I had together. So unfortunately, you don't get to hear it from her, but you get to hear it from us. Oh, okay. I was just going to give this to you.
And before we really get into the case story, I just want to give a brief introduction on behalf of Judge Waxman, because of course I am not Judge Waxman. I will be reading her role, but this is only on her behalf.
It's for dramatic.
Exactly. But I just wanted to talk for 1 second. Judge Waxman is the chair of our Judiciary's Human Trafficking Work Group. And one of the things that we've been talking about today is how important it is to get everybody in the judiciary, court management, leadership, everybody together on this if we're going to affect any real change. And so one of the things that our work group has really been working hard to do is how to get judicial education on this out to everybody. Even because as you've seen here today, this is an issue that comes in so many different ways, so many different levels, and in cases that might not on their face immediately seem to be trafficking cases. And so it's really critical that it's not just juvenile court judges who get this information, or it's not just district court judges, but all judges have this information. But that's, kind of a tall order, just as far as resources and infrastructure and how to get, the smaller jurisdictions who maybe only have one judge, and then it's very hard for them to travel all the way to have a training in person, et cetera. And so we've been working, sort of devising ways to get this information out, to have in-person trainings, to also have written materials that will be sent out in hard copy to all our judges, and to also have a web-based course that all of our judges can take that will be exactly this. And we would not be able to do that if it weren't for the strong support of court leadership and court management, and the collaboration just among all of our justice partners. So it is take that thought back to your home courts, and because it is definitely one of our biggest obstacles, is just how do we, practically speaking, how do we get all this information out to all of our judges? I say again, I'm reading this in the first person. I am not Judge Waxman.
She's like, I have to be clear about
exactly.
that.
I cannot make enough disclaimers. I met Alicia Riley in August of 2009. I was sitting in a criminal docket, and the state called the case of State versus Alicia Riley. Ms. Riley was charged with solicitation for an act of prostitution. This crime carries a 1-year jail sentence, $500 fine in Maryland. I was told that she had a drug problem and was in a treatment program. She admitted to the charge, and I found her guilty. I placed her on probation with continued drug treatment. I thought the case was over. I was wrong on many levels. I met Alicia Riley again in November of 2017. She was before me on a motion to vacate her conviction, requested by attorney Jessica Emerson and her University of Baltimore Law School student attorney. Ms. Emerson will explain the motion and the truths that were hidden from me in 2009.
So again, this process is about rehabilitation, right? It's about rehabilitating the client's criminal record, rehabilitating the client's life, and really giving light to facts that were not introduced at the time that Alicia was in front of Judge Waxman. Okay, we're quick, all right. So she is currently a 39-year-old female of color. What Judge Waxman didn't know was that she had childhood experiences with sexual abuse, with neglect, with parental substance abuse. The first time she was exploited, she was 12 years old. The first time she traded sex for money, she was 12 years old. She began coping, as so many of the survivors we work with do, through substance use. And the social worker in me kind of wants to draw your attention to that piece. I don't rarely ever use the terms substance use or substance abuse. I use the term coping through substance use, right? Because that's really what 12-year-old Alicia was actually doing. She relocated to Baltimore when she was 26 to escape her father, who had also been exploiting her and forcing her to trade sex for money. She met her trafficker when she was street homeless and engaging in commercial sex to feed her drug habit. Her trafficker used physical and sexual violence, along with her history of addiction, to exploit her. And what I mean is, it probably is easy for you to understand that I can give you drugs to make you more compliant, right? And to lessen your inhibitions. He did the opposite. He actually pretended that he wanted to get her clean. And it was the first person who had ever showed any interest in her self-worth, which she interpreted as love and caring. But what he was doing was actually an economic decision, because she was a hot mess when she was using, and she wasn't earning him enough money, right? So he uses physical and sexual violence along with her history of addiction. She is arrested multiple times for prostitution, with one conviction in 2010. So that's what Judge Waxman did not know when she found her guilty in 2010.
My role was easy in granting the vacature motion. But what do I say to this woman who expected help and safe harbor from the criminal justice system and instead got nothing? I thought about it for a long time. I knew I had to speak from my heart and not my mind, not something I've ever done before in court. I looked her in the eyes and apologized. I said I was sorry that I didn't know then what I know now, that I didn't know how to recognize symptoms of human trafficking or what questions to ask. I apologized for the lack of training for judges and all of the other agencies that should have offered her support and help. I told her how happy I was that I could help her start her new life as a certified medical technician. I saw a tear roll down her cheek. It took everything I had not to cry with her. I got off the bench and shook her hand. I don't think any of us will forget that day.
I was not as successful at not crying. But I hope that this, sorry, I know, I forgot about that. I'm so loud and I don't need a microphone, but we need it for this purpose. I hope that that story stays with you and resonates with you, because that highlights the power of post-conviction relief, both for the survivor and for the court personnel who intersect with those two actors. I mean, her clerk had her mouth open. The bailiff was slack-jawed. Everybody was impacted by this experience. So I say that simply to highlight the transformative process of post-conviction relief for survivors, and that's why I want you to go be great citizen advocates. You and I need to talk. Minnesota's got to get it together. Go back to your states, ask people about whether or not you have a vacatur law. Look up the vacatur law. Make sure it does all of those things that I said vacatur laws should do. And if it doesn't, go to your local trafficking task force and say we need a change here. I think we are almost out of time. Do you want to try to do a little bit of this? Or do we not have time?
I think, Jamie, do we have a minute? Okay, great, 2 minutes.
Just kidding.
Okay, so I touched on a little bit of this, afraid that we would not have time. But so human trafficking can appear in any kind of civil or criminal case. And so it pertains to judges at all levels of trial and appeal. And that is just so important to realize when you start to see how many different, this is not a one-dimensional problem. This is an infinitely complex and nuanced problem that appears in so many ways. And so it shows up in court in so many ways. And the more judges know about trafficking, the better they can recognize it and act accordingly. And not just in post-conviction relief. I mean, this, there are even, things, immediate concerns, safety concerns, in the courtroom. If the judge is understands the dynamics and knows who the players are, and then thinks to, for example, use a safe at home address confidentiality program if your states have that, but recognizing all of the issues that are actually before them in the courtroom. And I touched on this, that Maryland is taking a three-pronged approach, recognizing that just logistically, it is almost impossible to bring all judges together across the state. That's just, it's impossible. Scheduling concerns, fiscal concerns, et cetera. And so that's how we're tackling it in Maryland is in-person classes, the web-based course, and the written materials that will be sent out. But we definitely could not do that without, without strong support from leadership and court management. So I put that out to you to maybe bring home to your home courts, and I would love to hear about other innovative ways that you all are touching this issue. And I see that we are at 3:30 exactly. Oh.
Judge Waxman, one other point. She's been trying to say she's not Judge Waxman the whole time. There is a fourth way that the Maryland Judiciary is going about it, and that's once a year we meet in a judicial conference, and that's going to be one of the topics that's discussed at the judicial conference this year.
Yes, and that, Judge Morrissey, thank you for bringing that up. We had, at last year's judicial conference, we had a program on human trafficking, a breakout, not the plenary session, and the response was so overwhelming that this year it is now going to be the plenary, and which is just fantastic as far as, you know, like I said, the response we got, people wanting to know more, to hear it again. So thanks.
Thanks, Ed.
All right, thank you so much, everyone.